to do another brief test, and this is to see how your memory works during a period of learning. And I'm going to read a list of words, and I want you to try to remember them in order. It's going to be a long...
Hello and welcome to the VO2 Lounge. This is episode 57 on altitude training and the Tour de France. Altitude training, widely endorsed by top athletes, has become a key component of preparation across various endurance sports, from cycling and running to rowing and skiing. The physiological benefits include increased red blood cell production, enhanced capillary density, and improved mitochondrial efficiency, all of which contribute to better oxygen delivery and utilization, which is particularly important in an aerobic activity. However, the practice is not without controversy. While some argue that hypoxic exercise intensifies the training stimulus, critics highlight that lower oxygen levels at altitude can limit training intensity, potentially leading to relative deconditioning, especially in the elite athletes. Now, scientific evidence supporting altitude training is mixed. Numerous studies show hematological benefits such as increased red blood cell mass and improved VO2 max, yet many lack rigorous controls, making it challenging to attribute performance improvements solely to the result of altitude exposure. However, some research indicates no significant gains when returning to sea level, casting doubt on its universal efficacy. Now, despite these uncertainties, the persistent use of altitude training by elite athletes suggests practical benefits, likely driven by the dogmatic nature of coaching and anecdotal successes, aka someone went to altitude, someone won X Grand Tour or X Classic, for example, so we should all continue to go to altitude. For both elite and sub-elite athletes, the application of altitude training requires careful consideration. Elite athletes competing in high altitude events may gain from acclimatization provided by a balanced training intensity and recovery. Sub-elite athletes must weigh the high costs of logistics against potential benefits, possibly exploring simulated altitude training as a viable alternative. That could include like an altitude tent, essentially. Now, individualized approaches, monitoring responses and adjusting protocols are crucial for maximizing benefits, ensuring that altitude training, whether through direct exposure or simulation, aligns with specific performance goals. Now, despite this, elite athletes continue to spend considerable time and resources training at altitude, in many cases for low altitude events, particularly when you think of marathon runners who are competing almost solely in low altitude events when it comes to things like Boston, London, Berlin, these big marathon events, yet will introduce altitude work as part of their preparation. Now, again, we have the dogmatic effect of coaching opinion and findings of a large number of uncontrolled studies. Now, in the case of riders in Grand Tours, such as the Tour de France, it could be argued that they need this acclimatization to compete during the high altitude summit finishes to be a real GC contender. The argument still stands whether this is necessary or not is due to the volume and frequency of climbs over 2,000 meters in the Tour de France. Now, bearing in mind 21 stages, in 2020, the Tour de France, there were 4 split over 2 stages. In 2021, there were 3 split over 3 stages. In 2020, there was 1. And 2019, a particularly high year, there were 6 spread over 3 stages, of which were within the 6 of which 3 were in the same stage. Now, for some context and reference, 1,500 meters to 2,500 meters is considered an intermediate altitude broadly. Obviously, yes, in cycling, maybe you consider it a high altitude summit, but broadly speaking, it's considered intermediate altitude, and 2,500 to 3,500 is considered high altitude. Now, with this summary out of the way, let's get into the actual episode. But this, although I'm not directly referencing specific athletes in the Tour or so on and so forth, this came to my mind because we had recently, I think stage 4, I forget, they had a high altitude cycling specific high altitude, about 2,100 meters summit, of which was not the finish. The finish was at the bottom of the mountain. And it raises questions over altitude training, altitude preparation. They are always mentioning altitude training, whether that's at Flanders, whether that's at Paris-Roubaix, whether that's at the Tour de France. They're always mentioning it. So at this time of year, I thought it would be good to go back to a previous episode I have, recover it, add in some new bits of information, look a bit more closely at the controversy between different studies, highlight some of the methodology potentially used by these athletes, the downsides of altitude training as a modality in itself, like its effects on sleep and recovery, and how it can be quite easy to essentially get this method wrong, and how athletes in the past could have possibly got this method wrong, and talk about natives, and potentially is that clearly the way of which obtaining altitude adaptation / stimulus, and through simply genetics and having been born, raised, and historically from a high altitude region, and discuss some of the issues around repeated exposure. So how it doesn't necessarily mean because you did well from altitude once that you will do well again and have a similar bump in fitness, and how the repeatability, even on a in a way the efficacy of protocols, how that itself isn't necessarily set in stone, and how it's not as clear cut as given individual intervals they will have an increase in VO2 max. So without ado, let's get into this episode, starting with how altitude itself affects us. So air itself is a mixture of gases, primarily oxygen or O2 and nitrogen, whose combined partial pressures equals the barometric pressure of our essentially the atmosphere, or at least directly of where you currently are in this world right now. Now, despite the varying elevations on Earth, aka mountains, the concentration, this is the key bit when talking about altitude training, this bit here, the concentration of O2 remains constant at, let's round it up to 21%, but it's 20.93 roughly. So when you go to high altitude, the concentration of oxygen in the air is not changing. However, unlike water, air is compressible, meaning that the surface of the Earth's oceans, or sea level, is the base of a compressible ocean of air, essentially. As you essentially ascend in altitude, the barometric pressure decreases, which in turn lowers the partial pressure of oxygen in that atmosphere. And the reason I say is the Earth's sea level is like the bottom of an ocean of air, because it's easy to consider it that way, because think of the Mariana Trench, for example. When you're at the bottom of the ocean, you obviously have the pressure of all that water above you pressing down, right? 1 meter of water is 1 bar of pressure. Now, at that point, now the same is the case for air in the Earth's atmosphere. The higher you go, the less deep you are in the ocean, and therefore the less pressure, and therefore the less the air has been compressed, right? Now, the fundamental reason for reduced oxygen availability at high altitudes is the decrease in barometric pressure, leading to a hyperbaric hypoxia. Now, the relationship between atmospheric pressure and partial pressure of O2 diminishes logarithmically with increasing altitude. So at sea level, the atmospheric pressure, the partial O2 is approximately 159 millimeters of mercury. This value significantly drops to about 53 at the summit of Everest. Now, this decrease illustrates how the compressibility of air influences oxygen availability. By the way, if you look at a UK weather forecast, like for myself, you'll see the units of hectopascals, HPA, also called millibar, which is just another unit of measurement for atmospheric pressure. But essentially, think of your lungs as a plastic bag, essentially, of air that is coming in. Now, a bit like, well, not a bit, exactly how a turbo works in a car, where it is forcing additional air into the cylinder of the engine. It's compressed, which means there is essentially, yes, the same concentration of oxygen in that cylinder, aka in your lungs, right? Because the concentration is not changing. It's just there is more air present, actual more molecules of air present inside the same volume of space. So as you climb in altitude, that pressure reduces, aka the turbo's pressure set point reduces, which means you've still got 21% air in your lungs, but the actual pressure is lower, meaning that the number of molecules is lower. I don't know if there's an easier way to put it, but you could example it the density of materials, the idea of how much, what weighs more in a way, a kilo of feathers or a kilo of steel. You're almost looking at it of the fact that the higher altitude is like that kilo of steel, in the sense that steel weighs the same as the feathers but takes up much less area, and the feathers taking up far more area. It's almost like that in an inverse sense, or even in the same way of that if you try to cram the kilo of feathers into a space, you're going to be able to cram far more of the higher density, more compressed air into the same space. I don't really have another way of putting it, but simply more molecules present in the lungs at lower altitude, thanks to the air being compressed more and your volume of your lungs not changing, meaning that the more compressed air therefore has more molecules available in the same space. I think that makes sense. So what about the optimal altitude training method? Now we know why it's affecting us, essentially. So if you have the opportunity to engage in altitude training, determining the optimal altitude duration is obviously quite critical. And while the common sense might suggest that higher altitude yields better training benefits, but it's not always the case. High altitude can heighten the factors that inhibit exercise performance. Now, above 2,000 meters, individual may experience acute mountain sickness with symptoms like difficulty breathing, dizziness, fatigue, loss of appetite, vomiting, and nausea. And these symptoms can detract from the benefits of training by adding additional stress and discomfort. It's worth noting that obviously when you've got a stage where maybe obviously you're only at that 2,000 meters very briefly because, well, you're climbing, and say that they're on the climb for an hour, but they're not at 2,000 meters for that entire hour, and then they just descend back down. So it's completely different when you're spending prolonged hours, 8, 10, 24 hours up at that altitude, as to the effects that will become apparent over that time. Now, at altitudes above 4,000 meters, or like 4,500 meters, loss of muscle mass becomes more common, and the higher you climb, the more training can be inhibited. This can lead to the detraining effect, where the reduced training stimulus outweighs the benefits of altitude exposure, and therefore it's important to find a balance between sufficient altitude to stimulate adaptations without causing excessive sort of detraining. And it's not that, even if you found a road at 4,500 meters that you could do your training on, the stimulus essentially is just too much. The body doesn't need it. It's like when people train for their first 100-mile like event, not race, like event, or 200-mile event, like Unbound. You go out and you don't really ride much in the week, and then you do like a 150-mile ride, the stimulus is way too much for you because you're just not at that level. So it's somewhat wasting your efforts. And the same is the case for pretty much everyone. It's going up to 4,500 meters, too much stimulus, and would result in detraining rather than training. Now, a study by Levine et al. Investigated the effects of different altitude training strategies on 39 competitive runners. Now, the participants were randomly assigned to one of three groups for 4 weeks, living high 2,500 meters and training low at 1,200 meters, or B, living high again at 2,000, training high at 2,500 and training high at 2,500, or C, living low at 150 meters and training low at 150 meters. Now, the results showed that I did wonder why the low in the train high, relax low, whatever, train low is 1,200, whereas the live low, train low is 150 meters. Whether it was just part of where they were picking these people up from, I don't know, but it would be interesting to have the train low really low, like 150 meters. Now, the results showed that while VO2 max values and 5k race performance times improved by 4% in both altitude trained groups, significant improvements in running velocity at VO2 max and the venturi threshold at sea level were observed only in the group that lived high and trained low, sort of pointing towards that was the optimal kind of strategy, although the others all improved their times. So does it matter that VO2 max and venturi threshold at sea level have changed if all three groups if both groups saw a 4% boost in or improvement in time? Now, interestingly, the study noted that sea level controlled group experienced a 31 second slower 5k time, suggesting that the training stimulus was not fully controlled during the experimental period. And that's where this bit comes, that it's like poorly controlled. You read this, the first section, or saw social media posts that just highlighted this first bit, that the altitude trained group were 4% up, and then, without this bit saying that the other group got slower, there's no reason the other group should get slower for doing regular training. Now, regardless, the authors conclude that benefits of altitude training stemmed from a combination of high altitude acclimatization and the improved hematology, and low altitude training, which increased the training intensity or kept it the same. This led to the sort of advocacy of the live high, train low approach as the optimal strategy for altitude training, giving rise to the concept of altitude homes, where athletes sleep at altitude and ascend low altitudes to train, thereby maximizing the benefits of both environments. Now, pros and cons of altitude training is what's to be considered next. We've sort of alluded to it recently in the altitude sickness and so on, but let's quantify some bits, talk about VO2 max, talk about muscle mass and structure, the effects on sleep, and just talk about also the altitude-induced adaptions and why these changes in VO2 max could be occurring. So when people are exposed to hyperbaric hypoxia, they experience various reactions to the effects of altitude. Now, the primary basis for these pathophysiological changes is tissue hypoxia, so like the lungs. The greater the hypoxic stress and the shorter the time for adaptation, then the more significant the adverse effects are. So like going up to Everest, if you didn't stay at base camp for very long, for example, greater negative outcomes. So VO2 max. For athletes, a major concern is the impact altitude has on VO2 max, which obviously, I don't think I mentioned it, but maximum capacity of an individual's body to transport and use oxygen during exercise, or maximum oxygen uptake. which is a good metric for physical fitness, obviously. Now, VO2 max begins to decrease significantly above 1600 meters with a reduction of approximately 8 to 11, 12% for every 1,000 meters above that altitude. So it's where you can kind of reflect it back to the previous sentence or previous introduction regarding high altitude work at the Tour. So obviously any summit above 1600 meters, you would then see adverse effects in theory due to altitude. Now, an example, at the summit of Everest, the average sea level VO2 max of 62 mil per kg per min can drop to 15 mil per kg per min. Now, individuals with a VO2 max lower, so say 50, which is still, above average for like most people rocking about, will struggle to survive at the summit without supplementary oxygen. So anyone trying to do it without oxygen, got to be pretty fit. 62 mil per kg per min is a pretty aerobically fit individual. And 15 mil per kg per min is like you're really going to start struggling at it like a brisk walk. And so you think how slow you're effectively going to be crawling as you get higher up the mountain, because you just haven't got the sort of oxygen available to fuel the respiring cells and muscle contractions. So muscle mass and structure, something to be considered, especially when you've got people going to the Tour and they're already so depleted and they're already so lean. You can be getting into some somewhat dangerous territory here if you spend too much time there. Now, the sustained exposure to severe hypoxia negatively affects muscle structure. Now, chronic altitude hypoxia leads to a marked decrease in muscle fiber density and reduction in mitochondrial volume of anything up to 30%, which is, of course, detrimental to athletes. Now, this decline in mitochondrial volume is accompanied by like a significant decrease in the activity of enzymes responsible for aerobic oxidative metabolism and muscle oxidative capacity. Again, key metrics for endurance athletes. Now, the Operation Everest 2 project found that participants lost about 7.44 kilograms, averaging around an 8.9% decline in body weight. Now, that's a pretty significant percentage of weight loss due to the whole activity. Now, obviously, they're active individuals, but so are endurance athletes. So, CT scans of 6 subjects showed a decrease of 13% in the total muscle area of the thigh and 15% in the upper arms. The Operation Everest 3 study, which simulated an Everest ascent over 31 days, reported an average weight loss of 5 kilos among participants, attributing this to decreased appetite and food intake associated with hypoxia. So, really, you've got someone under stress already. You've got someone now doing a lot of exercise. When you add altitude into there, the effects, along with the appetite reduction, and this is why it's mentioned in various places, but if you are a team who on one of those summit finishes ends up with one of the hotels at altitude, you are at a notable disadvantage for the coming days, because one, sleep, as we're going to get onto, is impaired, desire to eat, ability to recover, all of this, the oxidative processes going on to help repair the body, not as potent. Now, sleep obviously is crucial for general health, and even more so under heavy training loads, which the Tour de France is definitely at. I wouldn't even call it a training load, just a heavy load. Sleeping at altitude will induce abnormal breathing patterns known as high altitude periodic breathing, which can lead to sleep disturbances, frequent awakenings, and a sensation of breathlessness. Now, this occurs in healthy individuals above about 1800 meters. Hypoxia at altitude reduces total sleep time, sleep efficiency, slow wave sleep, and REM sleep. Just sleep is thrown out the window in general at altitude. Now, additional hypoxia can increase the depressive mood, anger, and fatigue while reducing vigor, attention, visual, and working memory, concentration, executive functions, inhibitory control, and mental processing speed. And just although irregular breathing may subside with prolonged time at altitude, sleep quality is thought to remain compromised due to the persistent hypoxia, essentially. So even one day, especially considering that you don't really do a transition stage and then somehow end up at altitude, you've probably gone under a serious bit of load. As it says here, the prolonged time at altitude, so some kind of pre-adaption, doesn't necessarily result in the individual suffering less from the effects of altitude on their sleep. So again, questions whether it's necessary to some extent. Now, altitude-induced adaptions, that's what we've obviously spoken about, the fact that VO2 max is improved and all these other things, but we can go into a little bit more detail on exactly what's causing and what are the adaptions that are then resulting in these performance or proposed performance improvement. So altitude induced a range of physiological adaptions, which are obviously crucial for the acclimatization process, particularly affecting ventilatory response, hematological adjustments, and cardiac output, which obviously cardiac output really being a big one for endurance performance. Now, the increase in both depth and rate of breathing at a high altitude significantly boosts alveolar ventilation, driven by the hypoxic ventilatory response. This adaptation can increase arterial oxygen levels while reducing carbon dioxide levels, supporting enhanced oxygen delivery and utilizing during exercise. Now, obviously, that's just the depth you're breathing and clearing out the lungs and essentially utilizing more of the available capacity. Now, hematologically, altitude triggers like a transient rise in red blood cell concentration, primarily due to the reduced plasma volume rather than increased erythropoiesis or piosis. Or anyway, so let's kind of move on to a discussion about hypoxic training and whether it is beneficial in elite athletes. So this is all in theory that previous performance improvements are a result of altitude training, and there are plenty of sources that find results of altitude training dubious, basically. One is a paper titled Hypoxic Training is Not Beneficial in Elite Athletes. And they open with, hypoxic training can follow the live high, train high approach, LHTH, or live high, train low, LHTL, or live low, train high strategy. Below, we explain why we believe that available evidence does not justify recommending any of these strategies to athletes. We propose that LHTH and LHTL have been vigorously promoted for many years without solid evidence for their justification. What has been revealed is that extreme inter-individual and inter-individual variabilities in performance outcomes, suggesting that these practices promise little better than a coin flip. Even worse, they steal valuable time away from legitimate training practices in normoxia, or basically non-hypoxic situations. Now, supporters of live high, train high, live high, train low have often been negligent in their experimental designs, have not conducted legitimate investigations into the potential adverse effects, and have perpetuated a highly inefficient practice by ignoring athletes' phenotypes as a basis of individualizing treatments, which essentially just summarizes the fact that they think what I've kind of outlined previously is that yes, there is definitely evidence for adaptions occurring, but do they relate actually on a consistent individual to individual basis? Do they actually result in performance increases, or is it just that someone went to altitude, had a good performance, there is evidence supporting potential cases, so now it's perpetually prescribed throughout sport? Now, there is one bit of all of this that I do wonder, and that relates to doping, essentially. Now, obviously, there's the biological passport, and which, yes, let's just pretend that it works flawlessly, in the sense that it catches any major abnormalities that cannot be explained naturally. Now, say individual were to design a substance that is not on a banned list because it's brand new and made by some lab and given to the team, and an individual takes it and results in, rather than using EPO, for example, it just results in the uptick of red blood cell production, right, through other pathways. Now, that individual then may be picked up by the passport because their red blood cell count's high. And in this case, if they were to combine that with an altitude session, they would be gaining the benefits of this. They would see the uptick, and it could be explained by the altitude camp, assuming the increase wasn't too outrageous. And then the drug's never picked up because it's just not on the banned substance list. That's where I think things could be. This is all like a hypothesis, a thought. It came across my mind because so many teams use these altitude camps, yet the evidence, and just think of the stress involved of taking an individual, first of all, away from family for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks to go train, the risk of illness through the new environment, the flight, so on and so forth, the logistics, the cost, all these things that come into account, where it could be better purposed elsewhere for something that is either a dogmatic approach or is hiding something bigger, or what else? Because I would have thought teams would have, obviously they're doing it because they believe it's going to result in improved performance, but it honestly does not seem that clear cut that it results in, one, sea level performances, and two, whether the acclimatization is necessary for such a, in the grand scheme of things, low altitude summit, for example, in the case of finishing at a climb at 2,100 meters. But that's just a thought. I'm not suggesting it's done. I don't have any inside information. It's more just of a looking at where the dots lie and trying to connect them, basically. Now we come on to, obviously sort of hinted to in the previous paper, but individual variation in response to altitude training. Now, altitude training, particularly the live high, train low approach at moderate altitudes like 2,500 meters combined with low altitude training at around 1,200 to 1,300, for example, has been shown to significantly enhance maximal oxygen uptake, so VO2 max, and athletic performance compared to sea level training alone. However, individual responses to altitude training vary widely. Research involving 39 collegiate runners retrospectively divided into responders and non-responders based on their improvement in a 5,000 meter run times after a 28-day altitude, a 5K run time after doing 28 days at altitude camp, shed some light on factors influencing these varied responses. Now, they obviously have come in to say that the altitude work is beneficial and results in improved performance over sea level training alone. But let's see what they define. Now, responders who showed significant performance improvement exhibited a larger increase in erythropoietin, or EPO, concentration within the first 30 hours of altitude exposure compared to the non-responders. This is where also I feel like it sort of not the plot thickens, but it leads to more questions in the sense that, is it that the Tour de France people who are on the, say, the podium for the general classification, already selected through this natural selection process of, racing the bike, and then if altitude is necessary to compete at this level, then you are then naturally selecting for the individuals who do well at altitude. Therefore, they are still being sent to altitude because their blood work looks improved. Now, back to it. The initial EPO response led to a substantial increase in total red cell volume and VO2 max in the responders, whereas non-responders did not experience similar physiological gains. Now, additionally, responders were able to maintain in interval training velocities and oxygen flux close to sea level values during their altitude training, which contributes to their enhanced aerobic capacity and performance outcomes. Now, the prospective examination of 22 elite athletes further confirmed that acute increases in EPO and VO2 max were significantly higher in responders compared to non-responders after the altitude session bout. Now, these findings underscore the importance of both altitude acclimatization, particularly the hematological adaptations induced by EPO and effective training maintenance at low altitudes for optimizing the benefit of altitude training on athletic performance. Now, despite individual variation and previous studies showing mixed results on overall sea level performance improvements post-altitude training, these insights highlight key physiological pathways that can influence the effectiveness of altitude training and strategies. Now, the reason I'm trying to gather just people on both sides of the fence, because it just seems so, it's just all over the place in my opinion, as to nothing's clear cut. It doesn't seem to be like everyone's suggesting that you go to altitude and you're going to come back as Superman. It really isn't that clear. Now, you have another paper titled "The Reproducibility of Performance Changes to Simulated Live High, Train Low Altitude." Now, this study aimed to assess the reproducibility of responses to live high, train low altitude exposure among highly trained runners. 16 athletes underwent 2 separate 3-week blocks of simulated live high, train low at 3,000 meters of altitude, with physiological measures including maximal aerobic power, VO2 max, running economy, and hemoglobin mass, evaluated alongside a 4.5 kilometer time trial. Now, the results showed that changes in time trial performance were small and varied across both live high, train low and controlled sea level groups, indicating inconsistent improvements in competitive running ability following altitude exposure. Now, however, the live high, train low group consistently demonstrated reproducible enhancements in VO2 max, 2.1% after each block. Now, suggesting robust physiological adaptations to altitude training compared to the control group. Now, live high, train low athletes showed significantly greater improvements in VO2 max and hemoglobin mass, highlighting the effectiveness of altitude exposure in enhancing these key performance metrics. Findings really, they sort of underscore why physiological capacities like VO2 max and hemoglobin mass reliably improve with live high, train low. Actual competitive performance outcomes are influenced by additional factors such as fitness level, fatigue, and motivational factors. Now, that's where I wanted to step in and say that's, I think, the main conclusions that I sort of came to, was that there seems to be a little dispute in the triggers or the results of an individual going to altitude. Like, no one seems to really disagree that as a result of going to altitude, the body will adapt, with whether it's ventilatory response, whether it's red blood cell mass, and you'll feel better at altitude. What doesn't seem to be crystal clear is whether the effect of these increases actually results in a performance increase, for example. Yes, in theory, you would have thought an increase in your VO2 max would mean an improved performance, but like it says, it could be at too great a cost, whether it's stress, whether it's motivationally related, or whether simply the higher VO2 max for the nature of your event doesn't matter when it's a small change already at a high value. So this is where it again becomes quite muddy and really becomes a bit unclear. Now, a bit like when I did the episode on the Norwegian method of lactate threshold training, how they described that they were using these lactate meters to try educate Western runners on running at these like zone 2 and threshold efforts, like the 2 millimole and the 4 millimole efforts, by which the Kenyans reportedly could do naturally, right? There's an element here of potentially natives are going to always have this advantage, and non-natives are essentially trying to gain a similar advantage by going to altitude, but it might not be that simple. Now, natives of high altitude destinations appear to possess physiological advantages that contribute to their disproportionate success in endurance sports. Now, studies indicate that high altitude natives typically exhibit larger pulmonary diffusion capacity and structural metabolic adaptions in skeletal muscle. These adaptions result in more efficient coupling between ATP hydrolysis and oxidative phosphorylation, crucial for oxygen transport and utilization during exercise, thereby providing a clear competitive edge. Now, the extent of which these physiological adaptations are inherited versus acquired through hypoxic exposure remains a topic of ongoing research. Recent studies have identified specific genetic factors such as genes enhancing arterial oxygen saturation in Tibetan natives, which contribute to improved oxidation and resilience against altitude-related conditions like subacute infantile mountain sickness. Now, these genetic adaptations appear more pronounced in populations with long-standing altitude residence, spanning many generations, suggesting that prolonged exposure to high altitude confers biological distinctiveness and athletic advantages over short exposures, essentially meaning that unless you and your family and your family's family and their parents and whatever have lived there for generations, you may be being at the bottom of the wrong tree, because you may never be able to replicate that. And it's almost like in theory, if you got the right, and it can be why you get these South American individuals from places like Colombia who are incredibly good in the mountains, because of the fact that they and their families have gained these adaptations, not just through living at altitude, but through their families living at altitude. Now, I thought to end it, we'll go through a little bit of historical data on Olympic medal distribution, which further highlights the advantage of high altitude natives in endurance events like the 800 meter, 1500, 5000 and 10,000, and even the marathon, where they have consistently outperformed competitors from lower altitudes. Namely, for example, Kenyans, for example, they are a key marker of altitude and its effects on endurance performance, but in an extremely chronic format. We're talking generationally chronic. While the exact mechanisms behind this advantage warrant further investigation, these findings collectively highlight the significant role of altitude acclimatization, both genetic and environmental, in shaping athletic performance at high altitudes. Now, the exact stat that I'd like to share is that since 1960, the percentage of Olympic medals won by native Highlanders in comparison to the rest of the world is as follows. In the 800 meter, 30%. In the 1500 meter, 20%. In the 5K, 45%. In the 10K, 50%. And in the marathon, 34%. So clearly there is some advantage, but whether it's coincidental or a result of another part of their physiology, it's hard to say. And, you know, with like the sort of where doping is at the moment and Kenya, for example, you are always left wondering. But that kind of casts a little bit of more of a shadow on this whole altitude stuff. But what is worth noting is that something is going on there. For now, we'll just put it down to altitude, but maybe in the future, we'll find out what it really is. Now, what's your takeaway from all this? Well, what mine was that, you know, before I made the initial episode, I was like, yeah, altitude training, a staple of an athlete's program if they're going to compete at any Grand Tour. And then I was a bit confused why people would do it for low altitude events. Looked into it, was more confused. Looked into it again for this episode, and clearly people are in a disagreement. Not on the actual method of action, methodology, and the outcome, but when it comes to the performance outcome. The physiological outcome is somewhat clear that these adaptations happen, but do they improve performance is the question. And I'll leave that for you guys to answer. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating and sharing the podcast wherever you got podcasts from. Share your thoughts and suggest future topics at the VO2 Lounge at gmail.com or the VO2 Lounge Discord server. All of the links will be down below. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it is goodbye.